Atheists, the LGBTQIA+, they were right. I'm sure we'll never recover from this allegation, even though the allegations are true. We've been called out by the atheists, the LGBTQIA+, and I think it's finally time that we admit it, that they're right, and admit that, yes, we're biased. Some of these comments are kind of funny if you ignore how sad they are. They don't happen as often anymore because I'm not uploading as much, but you see in an epic conversation between Gamer King and Nick, we see that faith and religions are just man-made and reflect nothing more than historical biases. And so, in addition to talking about this boogeyman of bias, we're going to talk about some things that people confuse with truth and are used in propaganda. So my hope is today we're going to have a fun lesson in propaganda detection. And the first one that I want to talk about is intuition versus truth. So to illustrate this, we're going to drop some Christian apologists out of an airplane. We're going to drop David Wood first, and then we're going to climb a little bit higher and then drop Mike Winger. The question is who is going to hit the ground the fastest? Not first, but the fastest. And we'll assume that friction and a lot of those things are idealized. It's going to be the same. They weigh the same aerodynamics. Who is going to hit the ground the fastest? The answer is after about 12 seconds, they're going to be going the same speed and will hit the ground at the exact same speed because they're going to hit terminal velocity. Basically, friction from the air is going to slow them down to where they won't be able to go any faster. Now, let's say we throw Sean McDowell into the mix. Right after we drop Mike out of the airplane, I'm going to throw Sean McDowell out of the airplane. I'm going to push him past terminal velocity. Which of these apologists will hit the ground fastest? The answer to this is it'll be all the same, because Sean will also reach terminal velocity and hit the ground at the exact same speed. But the same can't be said for Wesley Huff. So for Wesley, we strapped a couple rockets to him and we threw him out of the airplane. And I'm going to say the names of these videos in this video to aid in my algorithm skills, because it's been a while and I'm getting rusty. So it'll be obnoxious, but I'm not making tons of reaction videos to all the awesome things going on, so give me a break. Wesley Huff will hit the ground before the rest of them because he's going to have rockets that bring him past terminal velocity. So if I hadn't studied physics, I would think that, in this original example that Mike Winger would hit the ground faster than David Wood because he's falling from a greater height. But terminal velocity at play, that might not be intuitive for some people. And so just because something is intuitively true doesn't make it true. It just means that it's efficient to understand the reasoning behind it. And so we're going to go over a few things like this that often get confused with truth. But before we get into those, we have to kind of understand what truth is. So truth is that which corresponds with reality. And the correspondence view of truth holds that there are subjective truths and objective truths. Subjective truths are different from person to person. Like, you believe vanilla ice cream tastes better. I believe that chocolate tastes better. Now, an objective truth claim can make, and this is where it gets a little confusing, going back to the ice cream example, can make objective truth claims about subjective truth claims. And the example of this would be Jim believes that vanilla is better, while James believes that chocolate ice cream is better. Their subjective preference that they themselves pick is subjective, but we're making objective truth claims about them. And so the existence of subjective truths does not imply the extinction of objective truth claims. Now, some will take kind of an agnostic approach to their understanding of truth and say that absolute knowledge of truth is not possible, and therefore absolute truth is not possible. And this objection confuses a few things. It confuses absolute truth with certainty. Reality or facts are still true regardless of how certain one is or is not. One's perception of truth does not make it true or false. It's just reflects one's own perception of it. Evidence or lack of evidence doesn't change facts. Facts stand on their own, whether you have a lot of evidence for it or you do not. Evidence allows for the discovery of truth. It doesn't change the truth. Evidence only allows for the discovery of truth, but it doesn't change the truth. Something that is true is always true. Evidence can show that one believes a lie, but it doesn't change the truth, since truth existed before people believed against it or for it. And so another objection to this kind of absolute truth is that there are things in between, and not everything falls into neat little categories. And we're going to discuss this a little bit later. And so things kind of exist on a spectrum, but just because some things can be placed on a spectrum in a certain context doesn't mean that we can't make objective truth claims about them. For example, just because someone is skinny compared to a sumo wrestler doesn't mean they don't need to lose a little weight. Now, some object to absolute truth because they think that it's too narrow. However, the very nature of truth is that it is narrow and it is exclusive. For example, there's only one correct answer for 2 + 2. Logical laws like the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, the law of the excluded middle, all require truth to be exclusive. Likewise, contradictory religions cannot be true according to the law of non-contradiction. So let's get into these. Opinion versus truth. Is pineapple on pizza good? That is going to be an opinion, right? That's different than saying there is pineapple on pizza in this photo. We already talked a little bit about intuition versus truth. Which, and this is another example, which will land first? I like physics problems, if you haven't noticed. If you fire a bullet or you drop a ball, the answer to this is they'll fall at close to the exact same time. Now, here is a great example of popular consensus doesn't make something true or false. It just makes it popular. They're not all doing "my heart goes out to you" or anything like that. This is the bad stuff that I'm not going to say on YouTube because I don't want it to get throttled. And so here we have a man here who's not willing to do that salute, and we need more people like this guy. And I think this is a perfect example of just because a lot of people believe something is true or right doesn't make it true or false. They could all be wrong. It's actually happened a lot throughout history. I love this one too. So expert consensus versus truth. If you're a real doctor, you're not just going to smoke a cigarette, you're going to smoke a Camel cigarette. And there's lots of pretty wild advertising from back in the day. I could show many examples. Wesley Huff, is an expert in destroying Billy Carson on Joe Rogan, except in that case, what he was doing was right, whereas these doctors advertising Camel cigarettes are not in the right. And so you can have experts that are right or wrong. Ooh, this one I won't say a ton of because I don't want it to affect the video. But here we have that if you get a poke for a certain virus, then the CDC and Fauci said that you will not get the virus. Yet that's not exactly what happened. And then back in 2021, we had the CEO of Pfizer claim that their poke specifically was testing to be 100% effective. And that turned out to not be the case, which isn't a huge surprise if you know what happened in 2009, which was the largest healthcare fraud settlement in the history of the United States. That ended up being about $2.3 billion by this little company called Pfizer. And so expert consensus doesn't make something true. And we see a little bit of why this can be, in that this is from Pew Research and reflects on how people trust scientists. You'll hear trust the science. And what you see is the left is far more likely to trust the scientists as opposed to people on the right. And that's likely because there is politics involved, and because there's a huge political divide on trusting science. Now, when people say trusting science, what it really is trusting interpretations that scientists make of data. Data are things that are observed. You could almost say that they're true facts about what's happening, even though experiments can be conducted in a way that will distort the data. But then that data has to be interpreted by scientists. And so if you disagree with the scientists, you're not disagreeing with science. Science is just a methodology. But anyways, experience versus truth. I remember when I was younger, I had a family member who was commenting on my love of pickles. I love pickles. And they said, if you crave pickles, then it must be good for you because you need it. And as a kid, I remember thinking, ice cream is something that I love, but clearly I don't need ice cream. But the challenge with things like this is, in the case of health, you actually can have examples of things that you crave that you do need. Like when you're thirsty, you need water. And so Mike Winger is the kind of guy that would have this pickle Snickers. If you know, you know. Just because something's been around for a long time doesn't make it true or false. It just means it's old. So longevity versus truth. One of the famous examples of this is the Earth as the center of the universe was kind of the cosmic model that was believed for a long time until Galileo and Copernicus there. Again, just because something has always been believed up till that point in history doesn't make something true or false. Tradition doesn't make something true or false. So in some areas of the world, it's very common to have people drink camel byproducts like the one on the screen here. And so the challenge with this is it puts you at risk for MERS, which is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, and a bunch of other things. But why do people do such a thing when there's so many problems associated with it? What we see is wisdom from an old wise prophet named Muhammad. And this passage says, the climate of Medina did not suit the people. So the prophet ordered them to follow his shepherd, his camels, drink their milk and urine as medicine. So they followed the shepherd, that is the camels, and drank their milk and urine until their bodies became healthy. Then they killed the shepherd and drove away the camels. When the news reached the prophet, he sent some people in their pursuit. And when they were brought, he did some stuff that will get us demonetized. Camel byproducts of the yellow variety are considered pure by one of the leading Islamic apologists. And there is a camel urine black market. So when we're evaluating whether something is true or false, it can be efficient if you understand that something's been around for a while, but it doesn't imply that it's true or false. Let's look at this quick clip here.
Once you've found the right doctor and have told him or her about your pain, don't be afraid to take what they give you. Often, it will be an opioid medication. Some patients may be afraid of taking opioids because they're perceived as too strong or addictive. But that is far from actual fact. Less than 1% of patients taking opioids actually become addicted. And any drowsiness that might occur when you start to take the medication will soon wear off in most patients.
So, do you know what that was an ad for?
If
I can get the video to stop here. That was an ad put out for a Oxycontin reformulation. The National Bureau of Economic Research found that there was significantly more drug overdoses following kind of this point in time, and you can see that on the graph here. One of the things that they said was, our findings indicate that the reformulation of Oxycontin had the unintended consequence of increasing overall overdose rates in location where Oxycontin had initially been misused. The researchers infer that the reformulation spurred an expansion in the illicit drug markets in those locations, leading to, over the past decade, to a net increase in death rates from heroin, fentanyl, and cocaine. And so they're related. The deaths of these celebrities on the screen, from Heath Ledger, Prince, Chris Farley, and Whitney Houston, some have attributed to be directly related to the problem with Oxycontin. And so with bias, we talked about bias, the very intro. The pharmaceutical companies are obviously biased in their favor to make money. That's why they'll put out ads like that in the research, either is not sufficient or contradicts what they're saying. So can we know anything if everything is biased? And the answer to that is yes. Obviously, we can know things, even though we have biases. But also, biases are not inherently evil. So here's one example of why that is. If we have a placebo and compare it to no treatment, if you offer a patient a placebo, it's called a placebo effect. It is a drug that does nothing. It's usually just like calcium or cornstarch. And people will feel better typically when they're taking the placebo. It's because they're biased to think if they take medicine that they'll feel better, but they will actually feel better. This is something that's widely reported in the literature. Another bias that can sometimes be a good thing is called optimism bias. And it's a cognitive bias that causes someone to believe that they themselves are less likely to experience a negative event. And entrepreneurs who have this, it can sometimes be helpful because it can force them to take more risks and encourages innovation and things like that, which can lead through to breakthroughs and business success, although it can set you up for failure. But it prevents you from being too pessimistic in your business endeavors. And so when we're looking at bias, we want to have some kind of objectivity when we're making a truth claim. But there's different kinds of objectivity. The first is psychological objectivity. Psychological objectivity is a lack of bias or commitment to a position on a topic. Psychological bias is possible in areas where a person has no interest in the topics one has studied or even has never thought about it. It's often a negative quality, and it's a sign that one could be apathetic or ignorant of the topic, and it doesn't imply strength or weakness to an argument. So if somebody says, I'm psychologically objective or I'm objective on a particular topic, often that means, realistically, they haven't studied it, they're ignorant, they don't really care about it. Because if you've actually studied and learned about a particular topic, then you're going to have some knowledge that's going to help you make a decision on whether something is true, false, good, or bad. This is different than rational objectivity, and which examines the way we know, the epistemic justification for what we know about reality, for a given belief. Rational objectivity is the commitment to logic and reason to provide grounds for a given belief. And this is the kind of objectivity that we strive for in removing bias from. It's possible to attain regardless of the presence of psychological objectivity. Thus, rational objectivity can be present when psychological bias is present. Jumping back to things that people confuse, particularly online, this is a huge problem. If somebody's really confident when they say something, that doesn't make it true. Now, this is an amazing photo. This is MacArthur Wheeler. And he is wearing lemon juice and thinks himself to be invisible. And there was a study that was done on this, and there's lots of videos on it. I'm not going to belabor too much on it. But they discovered something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is basically if you don't know a lot about the topic, you're going to be super confident. They call this the peak of Mount Billy Carson arguments. The peak of Mount Stupid. And then as you learn more, you realize, wow, I don't actually know that much about this topic. And you can enter this sort of slope of enlightenment and then kind of plateau. Although this graph, I probably shouldn't have put guru. That's kind of a lot of those guys aren't exactly peak competence. So just because something's complex or simple doesn't make it true or false. And I think a good example of on the complexity side, that's not crazy complex, is if you watch my interview with LGBTQ activist Brendan Robertson, he has these kind of pretzels that he puts himself into that sound complex if you haven't heard it before, but they're just obviously not true. And so on the flip side, though, you can have people that say the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. In that kind of simplistic argumentation, doesn't make something true or false either. Just because something simple doesn't make it true. I have a video also on multiple universe theory that Dawkins, I don't know if he still believes it, but he did at one point. So in talking about kind of the origins of the universe, multiple universe theory will say that, there's actually an infinite number of universes in existence. And we just happen to be lucky enough to live on one where life is viable. And that's how life is possible, basically. And I have a video on why this is kind of a silly idea and doesn't help the atheist case for a lack of God in the formation of the universe. And so I'll put that in the description if you want to learn more about that. And on the complexity side, we have the story of the midwives where they basically lie to the Pharaoh, and it saves the lives of the baby boys, and we see God bless them. And so is lying always wrong? And the answer to this is actually not super simple. And I also have a video that talks about this at length. We have what people confuse an aesthetic appeal with truth. Now, I'm going to kind of straw man this meme, and I realize that, but it'll work for the point. So just because something is beautiful, elegant, or aesthetically pleasing, and may even feel true, doesn't make something true or false. Now, I'm a big fan of making things beautiful and things like that, but like if I had crooked teeth, which I do a little bit, that doesn't make anything I say true or false. Just because we have ugly buildings as Protestants doesn't make what is taught true or false. It just means that we have Pizza Hut churches every once in a while. This is one I hear all the time, and it's because I think some of it is we get taught to believe this by politicians, and they'll explain ideas along a spectrum as if something along a spectrum can be true or false. The further you are on one spectrum, the more true you are. The further going the other way, the more false you are. But truth doesn't exist on a spectrum. It's either true or false. But you don't want to confuse that with certainty. In Christianity, we have a lot of views on the end times or eschatology, and I think there's a great example of the spectrum of truth where you'll have people in these different views, and it's not that, like, if you're closer to one view, like if I said I lean more towards a particular view, that truth doesn't exist on a spectrum. Just because you have this kind of spectrum doesn't mean that if you're on one side or the other that you're right or wrong. It just means that people have varying opinions on these kinds of things and various certainties. So I don't see this one very often anymore, but it was a really big deal when there's a big TikTok trend with oil pulling. And I'd have a lot of patients ask me about it, what do you think about it? And I think I need to actually put a disclaimer. This is technically not medical advice for legal reasons. But yeah, it's super ineffective and really doesn't, you may as well just rinse with water is certainly cheaper. But the efficacy of swishing with oil just really isn't there. So brush your teeth and floss, do those two things, limit sugars. That will get you everywhere you need to. So we're going to end on kind of truth versus narrative as far as things people get confused with, just because this clip is so stinking funny.
Trump has kind of been thrown on his heels by this, and he's not really sure how to go after Vice President Harris. He knew his attack lines on President Biden. He really has struggled with how to go after someone who's 20 years younger than him, who is a different gender, a different race. It's kind of been this moment where he has not been able to coalesce around a single attack line.
I know you guys are objective over there, that you just report the news as it is. Oh, I know. CNN makes a... I know.
Was that supposed to be a laugh line?
I wasn't supposed to be, but...
So good. That will never not be funny. So the narrative that Stephen Colbert has tried to put out is like, oh no, you guys are objective over there at CNN. And even his super left-leaning audience is just like, that's hilarious. Just to review, these are the kind of things that we talked about that people often confuse with true. So how do you know that something is true? I'm going to briefly touch on this. There's lots of good resources out there. I'll put a couple on the screen that I would read if you want to learn more about how to know what is true. But how do you know an argument is true? Is the argument formally valid? Does it follow the rules of logic? Is the argument informally valid? Does it, you can have an argument that follows rules of logic, but it can fall prey to fallacies. And then you have to ask, are the premises of the argument true? And is the premise more plausible than their contradictories? I could spend a long time talking about just this slide, but you should get off YouTube and read a few books. And so you can go read those books that I put on the screen there and take a break from the internet. And we'll see you in the next video, which I don't know if it'll be a conversation with Brendan Robertson. We do have a second one scheduled. I also, one of the reasons that it's taken so long to upload a video is I have one of the biggest, well, it is the biggest project I've ever worked on the topic of education. I'm super pumped for it. It'll be a while before it comes out though. And so don't hold your breath, but it's going to be, I'm super excited for it. And so thanks for watching and revisiting the channel for my sporadic upload schedule. And the next time somebody calls you biased, it's okay. We're all biased.